So today I want to do something a little bit different. Today I want to talk about the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a game that's often discussed in game theory and economic theory, specifically through the works of John Nash. And I want to do this by examining it from a more collectivist and anarchist perspective than how it's typically represented under capitalism. If you're not familiar with the game mechanics, basically you have two prisoners, prisoner A and prisoner B, and they are being held in two different holding rooms away from each other. There's no lawyers, no communication between each other. I mean, I don't know why there's no lawyers, but apparently there's no lawyers. The police have caught them on a minor charge, but believe they've committed a major charge. The minor charge will net them 1 year in prison. The max sentence for the major charge is 7 years. However, they're told if they betray the other person, they can reduce that sentence down to either nothing or 3 years, depending on how the other person responds. So essentially, player A and player B are being put in the position to remain silent or betray one another. And the digits here represent the number of years that the prisoners would get in certain circumstances. If A and B both remain silent, they both get 1 year in prison. If A and B both betray each other, they get 3 years in prison. If A betrays and B stays silent, A manages to get 0 years, but B gets 7. And the opposite occurs between A and B if the opposite happens. Basically, they are now in this position of having two choices and go. So the major economic understanding is that this will reach what's known as a Nash Equilibrium. Basically, all the players, knowing the rules of the game, will take the optimal choice, knowing what the other players will do. Essentially, because we can predict the patterns of other players, we ourselves can reach an optimal choice and have no reason to deviate from that decision. And the Nash Equilibrium ends up being for both players to betray each other. Why is that the case? Well, the solution states that by playing the game in the most rational way, and what they mean by rational every single time you see this in economic theory is they mean selfish. By playing it as a self-serving person, someone who wants to maximize for themselves. So it already ingrains capitalist thinking into the understanding. The notion is that by betraying, you get a better situation no matter what the other person does. So if you betray as player A, if player B stays silent, you get no years in prison. That's better than a year in prison. So you should take that option. And if person B betrays also, you get 3 years instead of 7. So that's the better option. Basically, because 0 is less than 1 and 3 is less than 7, you are incentivized through selfish rational thought in order to betray the other person. However, this denies a lot of reality. The idea that you and another prisoner would be both committing the same crime together and you wouldn't have some sort of connection or ties to each other, or some sort of understanding, or maybe even discuss something like this beforehand, or that there's no lawyers present, or that we don't have any of the workings of a criminal justice system at play except for the arbitrary justice of a police officer. In this particular case, as if the police officer can be the judge and jury here. There's a lot wrong with this particular game, and I acknowledge that. But I also, even without all of that, prefer to look at this game from a slightly different perspective. The best solution here is very clearly if both of you end up with 1 year in prison. And because I personally would see myself as more of part of a collective or social order with the other prisoner, who I presumably have worked with, rather than the police, I, being a rational person, would see this best option and would take it. I would choose to stay silent. Why? When economic theory says to betray? This is an argument I actually had with an economics teacher before. My position is collectively, the betrayal gives us both a total of 6 years. All the options that involve betrayal involve 6 or 7 years of prison time. So I'm willing to gamble us collectively getting 2 years rather than us in total getting either 6 or 7 years. And if the other person, being a collectivist, rationalized the same way, we would come to the economic understanding that we would both reach 1 year in prison as the optimal solution. And you could ask, well, what if the other person betrays you? Well, then I get 7 years in prison. Which is the worst case scenario for both of us, since we were working together. But it's the best case scenario you could argue for the other person, right? Maybe not. There's some cultural understandings that the shame that the person would be dealing with for those 7 years could be a greater punishment than the prison time. There's certain understandings that selflessness that is betrayed can be a problem. And again, this is also speaking to something that happens in one moment of time, not to the larger understanding of a relationship between two players in this type of game or scenario. Now, before I go on with other examples and to talk about other issues with the prisoner's dilemma, there was actually a situation that the prisoner's dilemma was tried in real life. And I have an article from Business Insider that talked about this. And basically the conclusion that they reached is that despite the Nash Equilibrium, despite the betrayal being the best option, 37% of students and 56% of inmates actually cooperated in the game. Meaning 13% of student pairs actually managed to get the best outcome, whereas 30% of prisoners did. Which tells you that maybe there's something to, the idea that prisoners will band together in this particular way. Furthermore, behavioral economists have actually argued for years that while the Nash Equilibrium is mathematically interesting, it doesn't line up with human behavior. So, what does line up with human behavior? Well, I want to look at a few examples as to how we could force the hand of the collective results, even if you have a situation of selfishness in a population, and show that collectivism truly is the best option. In another scenario, you have 2 factories. And in these 2 factories, they are running along a river. And if the 2 of them reduce the amount that they pollute by using a different method, they will both in total produce 3 units each. We'll just call them points for now. But it's a unit that they can sell for lots of money, okay? They get 3 units. Or 3 points. If they both decide to pollute the river because of the cost that it would take to have to deal with the pollutants in the river, they will only get 2 units each. However, if one pollutes and the other one doesn't, because of the minimal pollution from only one of them, and because they are maximizing their result, the polluter will get 4, but the reducer will only get 1. Because of the way that the system works, okay? It's an example. It's not perfect. Again, there's issues with this type of example, but this is another one that's often cited between factories on a river. So in this scenario, you do have strict competition between Factory A and Factory B. They are not working together. They are producing the same object, the same type of thing, and they are in direct competition with each other. It is safe to assume that because of this antagonistic relationship, they will both pollute. Well, one of the examples that can be used to force them into both reducing their emissions is to have the state induce a penalty. The state can induce some incentive to reduce the incentive for them and change the dynamic in order for pollution to not be the optimal result. If they put a penalty of -2 points, then reduce for both of them is the best option. So you can have a benevolent outside force come in and do this. Now, am I arguing that this is how it works in real life? No. The state is actually a third institution that would probably be working with these two organizations. And first of all, the penalty would probably be more akin to 0.1, which really wouldn't change the dynamic of things. And second of all, that's assuming that the two companies don't band together and decide to try to buy off the politicians for 1 unit or a half unit and continue polluting at 1.5 units or 1 unit each. Basically, cronyism makes this not work. Now, would direct democracy work here? Potentially, right? If people collectively owned the river and the factories had to be accountable to the people and their position was taken into account for the needs of the river, then perhaps this kind of thing would work. But as states go in this day and age, I have my doubts. So another way to produce that result is to have such a drastic outcome as to make it generally unreasonable to even go for the selfish option. In this particular case, what we're looking at is the Cold War policy of nuclear deterrence. Here we have the USSR and the USA both with nuclear bombs. If the USA bombs, there is every chance and likelihood that the USSR will bomb. They both know the likely outcome of that choice. So if they do, there's mutually assured destruction. So nobody's going to take that option. Nobody's going to risk the option where they optimize us coming out alive, 1-0 or 0-1, where the other one is destroyed. In fact, part of the Cold War struggle was often, especially in the United States, trying to develop a weapon that was so quick that the Soviet Union could not respond to that weapon, and you could not have mutually assured destruction, but a one-sided destruction. But until that happened, which it didn't, the USA and USSR actually settled on the collectivist understanding that not bombing each other into oblivion and possibly destroying the world is probably a good idea. So mutually assured destruction actually provokes a selfish version of collectivism. But the model I want to examine more is how I feel people tend to relate to each other on a more typical basis. In most situations, it's not like the prisoner's dilemma in a single unit, where you interact with people and then you just leave them. Like, you don't just interact with people once. Maybe in commerce you tend to do that, but if you're going to deal with your coworkers, if you're going to deal with friends or relationships, you're not typically going to do that. So in this particular game, we're just going to use points. So in this case, if A compromises with B and B wants to compromise with A, they both get 3 points. If A defects and B compromises, A will get 5 points, B gets none. If they both defect, they both get 1 point. So obviously the best option is still to defect, right? Well, actually no, because what's been shown is that when you have a mutual relationship like this, and you defect all the time, the other person is likely to defect all the time too. Meaning that you will both collectively and individually you'll produce 10 units each, thus producing 20 total units. However, if you both compromise, you produce 30 units each, and that makes 60 total units. Or points, right? If A decides to compromise the entire time and B decides to defect all the time, you'll still produce less than the compromise results, but you'll end up in a situation where B gets everything and A gets nothing. So how does one play this in a long-term relationship? Well, the optimal solution has been found, and that solution is actually one called tit for tat. And what happens in tit for tat is person A always starts with a compromise. Always. You always lead going forward on a good foot. Person B then either chooses to compromise or defect. If person B chooses to defect, person A knows their next move now. Person B defects. This can lead to a lot of different scenarios, such as person B consistently responding with defects across the board, where person A will end up defecting across the board as well, and A does slightly worse than if person B, than if they have just defected across the board. It's not that much of a difference. However, person A having compromised, if person B compromises, person A will respond with a compromise. Person B has compromised. Person A goes back and compromises again. Let's say person B does now defect, seeing an opportunity. Well, I've got this person's trust, I'm going to steal from them. Person A comes back and retaliates. Person B continues to defect and now sees that the retaliation has happened and says, wait a second. They were being nice to me when I was nice to them. So I am going to go back to compromising. And yes, A defected. But B, hopefully seeing the pattern, and in a rational situation will recognize now that A will compromise, and then B will compromise again, and they will reach a permanent situation of compromise, which produced an optimal collective goal of as close to the 60 units as possible. And again, this has been shown through multiple tournaments of creating behavioral AIs, that this is the optimal solution, going tit for tat with your opponent. And the reason for this is that tit for tat actually provides a certain set of principles that has been shown to work well in terms of economy with people you're dealing with consistently. One is that it's known to be what's called nice. Nice basically means that you're optimistic. You start the algorithm always with a compromise. The truth is most of the models that went through cycling through different forms of behavior ended up when they took all the models in a study, right? They took all the different models that went into the study and the different tournaments that were going on. They determined that nice results worked a lot better than not nice results. Basically, if you started off with the original premise and you deceived your opponent, you betrayed them, and defected, you actually produced a much worse result. In initial games, you would do better. But as time went along, you actually pitted out and reached a point where your function wasn't going to work, especially when tit for tat was employed against it. The next factor is that it's retaliating. Basically, nobody can get away with attacking you because you're going to attack right back. You're not a doormat. You're not going to have the situation where the other person gets 50 and you get none. That's not acceptable. The other person will be dealt with. The strategy is also forgiving. And what's meant by that is that if the opponent defects, you're not holding, and then decides to later compromise, you're not going to hold a grudge against them. Because there is actually a grudge strategy in which the second the opponent defects, you keep defecting the rest of the way and completely shut them out. So forgiving means that you're willing to go back as long as the other person compromises, you are willing to compromise back. And the other factor is that it's not envious. And what that means essentially is you're not trying to maximize your points. You're trying, or score more than your opponent, you're trying to maximize result. And so it's these four categories that end up producing the best result in the iterated prisoner's dilemma that I just provided. Essentially, responding to selfishness with a negative consequence ends up producing the best result while rewarding selflessness. And from what they've shown, all of the models that started off as selfish over time, the number of selfish models being submitted into tournaments actually decreased over time. And so selfishness was essentially eradicated by the tit-for-tat method. In most cases, you had full cooperation between both units, meaning the optimal solution for this type of experiment is for everybody to cooperate. And expanding this argument of the prisoner's dilemma out to more people, you actually get the idea of the tragedy of the commons that I have actually covered in another video, which I'll put in the link, the description. I'll put the link in the description below. The tragedy of the commons basically is a larger model where instead of having 2 people, you're running on a set of, say, 10, 12, 15, 100 people, right? And you're all sharing the kind of thing. So you all collectively punish and ostracize someone who is an outsider. Now, there's issues with these models, right? There's no option to remove yourself from the game. There's no option to take your game elsewhere and go play with other nice people. You are forced into interactions that wouldn't necessarily model real-world scenarios. Technically speaking, you could break the game at any time. But in all of these instances, whether it was the prisoners who were looking at the number of years they would get and trying to minimize that, whether it was factories, whether it was the US and the USSR going to war, or whether it's you and another person trying to collectively produce the most for yourself. The best option is when we work together and we collectivize. This is why I believe that in a future where we're seeking the best outcomes for humanity, we need to start looking at models of collectivism and collective group understandings of things rather than the selfish model. We produce better results. We get better outcomes if we trust each other. And it is fear of being betrayed and hurt and not having the ability to deal with that and having that be a devastating impact upon us through something like scarcity or any number of other things that actually denies us the ability to form these collectives. We should move towards socialism. Heck, we should move towards anarchy. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.